Hey folks, welcome to our first live stream of Psychic Militancy. My name is Lara Shihan. I'm joined here by my two comrades. I'm so excited to have them. Thanks everybody for joining us. And this is streaming also on East as a podcast. Make sure you subscribe, all the things. I'm gonna jump right in. Our two guests are some of my favorite comrades, some people that I follow for the most precise analysis on what's happening in Latin America and definitely right now in Venezuela. So I'm really excited they're going to be in conversation here with me. Let me just quickly say who they are. Geo Maher is coordinator of the WEB du Bois Movement School for Abolition Reconstruction. And Geo, I want you to sort of plug that as well, because you all are doing such amazing work. And of course, he's a author, prolific author. I mean, I think you come out with like a book like every year or something like that. So but 5 books, including We Created Chávez and Building the Commune. And then Alex Aviña is probably known to many people here. He's an associate professor of history at Arizona State University and a historian of Mexico and Latin America. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a fucking week and you all are in high demand. I feel like between the both of you, you've done like 50 interviews or something like that. How are you doing?
It's been wild, man. It's been rough. First and foremost, I'm so glad to be here with both of you. And for folks watching, like it's hard to communicate how much like these are like the homies, right? These are like solid, smart, incredible people who do incredible work. And there's not that many folks like this out there. So I'm incredibly glad to be here and to be in this conversation, especially in this week where I think we're all losing our minds at least a little bit.
Yeah. Or trying not to. Trying to stay focused.
Yeah, same for me. I mean, it's an honor to be on with you guys, and congratulations, Lara, on the new podcast. So, yeah, I'm really honored to be with two of my closest comrades, and yeah, I agree with Geo. Just trying to keep up in real time, and I mean, I think trying to understand what's going on in real time based on really limited sources of information is always, especially when you're trying to be honest. And you're politically committed and you're not trying to be pro-empire, it's a really difficult task, but it's a necessary one. So I've always turned to the both of you to help me get through these times.
So, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, the podcast is called Psychic Militancy. There's a reason that we wanted to do this, partially is because psyops and psychological warfare is a central piece of this. And we've already been seeing this across the board, right? Folks are sort of preemptively caving or falling into despair or anything like that. One of the things that I love about your analysis, the both of you, not only are you militantly anti-imperialist and don't cede any space, but one of the things I've heard you both say in this week, and maybe you can speak more to it, is you're both attuned to the patterns of this. Like you understand the patterns of empire. In many ways, this is a natural extension of how the US empire has dealt with Latin America for ages. But on the other hand, you're not quick to be like, yeah, this is the same. This is like just the same thing. So I'm wondering if you both can speak to that, because I think part of remaining militantly clear is being aware of the mechanics and the structures and everything at play. So what have you all been thinking about in terms of both the patterns, but also what's new? Like why does this feel like this right now?
Go ahead, Gio.
No, I was going to say, go ahead. No, I think
we're supposed to talk over each other. Come on.
A really important prompt because, we see so much historical repetition, right? We see so much of the same, but I think it's really important to understand, and like, this is what dialectics means, right? Is that we need to understand how these things emerge on a historical terrain, right? As Fanon puts it, and I'll talk about Fanon a lot, I'm sure, or my little Fanon shirt, just to be prepared for the conversation. But as Fanon puts it, all things emerge, everything's a question of time. Temporality, right? And when I say that that's what dialectics means, I mean that's how the terrain is formed, that's how it's established, it's how we understand how individuals come to play a role in historical unfoldings, right? And so it's like, for example, and Alex, I think, has been very good at this, so I'm sure he's got a lot to say about how what's happening and what's coming from the US State Department today and the government is not entirely new, but it's all, it doesn't just come out of nowhere, right? It's an action on an existing terrain. It's of course, an attempt to reset and reshape a longstanding, historical terrain, say something like the Monroe Doctrine, but also to reframe it in very, very new terms. And when we think about it on that terrain, whether it's the right or whether it's the ongoing struggle in Venezuela, we have to understand it in that way. How do these different actors enter history what kind of history is sort of laid out before them? How are they free to act? How are they unfree to act? And what is it that they do? Right. So because Trump is a reaction to a moment, right? A reaction to a moment where empire, the U.S. empire's internal decline has been internal decline, where he's trying to use a projection of force, and that's their language, right? Projection of power to shore up and stabilize that. I think we see that as a sort of, staving off the inevitable collapse of U.S. hegemony. But that's been an ongoing collapse for some decades. He's very honest about that. He and his sort of advisors know that that's coming, and they're making a power grab for resources, but also for projection. I want to say something very quick. I'm sure you both have lots, to say about the word projection, right? Because it's, of course, like a fucking psychoanalytic word too. But what's, I think, kind of honest about that is that, and I see this very heavily with the way that Trump understands tariffs as well, is that projection is a sort of performative act of, we do not have power yet. How do we make that power become a reality, right? And again, that's something honest, and it's also something that speaks to sort of profound vulnerabilities of U.S. power, right? Which is they don't control Venezuela. They are in a decline. It's not simply the resources, it's the image, right? So, and when I say the tariffs, I mean, like you weren't ever going to have these fucking tariffs across the globe. You actually knew on an economic level that would be catastrophic, but you wanted to leverage the threat of tariffs, make that threat seem real as a way to then leverage concessions, right? And the concessions have been real, right? The terms of U.S. trade have been, reshaped by the threat of tariffs, the threat of worse, right? And you see this today on the military terrain, the threat of worse against Mexico, the threat of worse against Colombia. The goal of that is to change the negotiating terms for a declining empire.
Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, there's going to be a lot of I agree after when I follow you guys. But I mean, this is the history of U.S. empire in the region. I think what Geo's saying is really important. This is not a new thing, right? The projection of power to change the terrain on which U.S. empire can operate in a moment of weakness. I mean, the fact that they have to constantly reiterate that they're so strong, that the hemisphere is ours, and that they actually then use violence, that's actually a weaker way of trying to project and implement U.S. hegemony in the region. Once you turn to violence, particularly this type of violence, that's a conceit, I think, of weakness. And if you think back to the national security strategy that they put out a couple of weeks ago, where they signaled, okay, we're coming back to Latin America, we're coming back to our quote unquote hemisphere. I mean, that document, I think, is a conceit. It's a conceit of weakness, right? What they're essentially doing in that document is to say, we can't compete with peer rival nations, particularly China. Therefore, we're going to come back home, which is what the U.S. has done historically, right? Anytime that they get challenged abroad or they suffer some sort of political or military defeat, they come back and take it out on Latin America. And so I think what Geo's saying is really important. I know that we're bombarded with disinformation, with propaganda, whatever we want to call it, to make us feel hopeless and weak. But another way to read the situation is that this is an empire in terminal decline. And the fact that they're having to use these like gangster mafia-like tactics to reassert, for them to say, we are actually powerful. Please believe us. We are actually powerful. I think this shows that weakness. And the fact that they have conceded Asia or that sphere of influence or whatever type of language they want to use to China, and then come to Latin America and try to hit China indirectly by hitting a country like Venezuela. I mean, I think that highlights some of the vulnerabilities that Geo just mentioned. And I think we need to keep that in mind. They don't run Venezuela, right? This is a country of like 25 to 30 million people. It's a huge
no matter
country.
What Stephen Miller says.
I mean, he's the principal chicken, the chicken hawk, right? Like that's his job, is to continuously reaffirm on these insane talk shows how powerful and how strong the United States is. But there's other things, there's other forces at play that we're not really talking about, or we don't get a lot of insight into, that demonstrate the opposite, right? So they're not running Venezuela, right? They're not running this country that's like twice the size of California, 25 to 30 million people, that's had a revolutionary political project for 2.5 decades, right? Like, it's not whatever they say they're doing, or what they wish to do. Is going to counteract and already is it going to confront certain obstacles, primarily the people of Venezuela.
And that's like, I think that speaks really clearly to what Lara was raising, right? In terms of, it's not optimism, right? Like, I think optimism is a flawed concept, because we don't know what's going to happen, right? But
Yeah.
it's a question of sort of like resolve, right? And or something like optimism of the sort of the struggles to come, because we, like, and to say that they don't run Venezuela is also like an understatement, right? Like, it's like they literally. So all right. So funniest, best part of the week, right, is Trump standing up there and saying, no, Maria Corina Machado doesn't matter. That's the funniest shit I've ever seen, first of all, because she's fucking terrible, right? This so-called Peace Prize winner, who is one of the most violent, fascistic members of the right-wing opposition, who could never win an election in Venezuela, who never had any popularity. Why? Because she constantly supports U.S. intervention into her own country, right? Like, no one will ever en masse support that, right? A few fucking locones in Doral will support it, but on a mass level, they don't, will never support that. That's why she could never win an election, right? So that's funny. So when Trump, the only true thing he said in his press conference was Maria Corina Machado does not have the support of the Venezuelan people. Fucking hilarious. Anyway, but the point of that, and the point of bringing that up, is that this first U.S. strike by by this incursion to kidnap Maduro and Celia Flores brought the entire logistical capacity of the U.S. military to bear on a 2-hour operation. And they are, first of all, talk about projection and talk about like this sort of constant reiteration of power, right? They were so proud of this action that it makes you wonder, like, what did they think was going to happen, right? It makes you wonder, like, on what level did they actually not have much faith in their own capacity to do this one thing, right? The one thing. And they're talking about a second wave that will not happen, or if it happens, it'll actually be much fucking messier for them. They are so committed to having zero casualties. That's a huge weakness. They cannot manage and run the country in any kind of way. And that's why they cannot invite Edmundo Gonzalez or Maria Corina Machado into power, right? That's why they can't put a puppet government in, because they know Venezuela would be and will be ungovernable. Right. The only people that can govern Venezuela are some kind of Chavistas, right? And again, we could talk a lot about what Chavismo is or isn't, or who is in power right now. I'm not sure this is the time for it, but there are things that are worth knowing, right? Which is that we don't know exactly what they're going to do, and no one has 100% faith that that those in power in Venezuela currently are the most radical people, which they aren't, right? But the question is, they are the only ones with an apparatus in place to actually manage the country, and Trump knows that. That is a massive weakness for this whole plan and this whole strategy.
And that's not the point, right? To know everything that's going to emerge is not the point. And I think that's for us to stay focused on, is that these things also emerge by people on the ground, and they make decisions about this. What we know for sure, it is not for empire to come in and make these decisions for them. But one of the things that I love that you're both saying is that there's a way in which the way this has unfolded, the propaganda, the talking points of empire that are very familiar to us, are also about inducing an action in us, like psychically and affectively, to sort of preemptively seed psychic space and think that this is a fait accompli. That cannot happen. Like, their violence, even just in terms of firepower, any one of these things, can't actually happen without us also joining in saying, yeah, okay, this is just, brute empire, and this is what it does. And then all the other concessions we make internally, which is why this feels really important. I think you both have a way of being extremely precise about language and about your analysis. And that's, I think, part of what I want folks to remember, is that the force of empire doesn't work in the way that it intends if your psychic terrain also is not stolen along with it. And I think there's a lot of pieces that I hear you bringing, but like, what would it be? What should people be paying attention to? Like, what's the fuckery that's happening right now that empire is doing that we need to like be aware of? You've said some of it, like, be aware of what's happening. Folks are in the street. Overwhelmingly, nobody's supporting this fucking right-wing government or the coup attempt or anything like that. But has there anything else that has emerged in this week that you all are thinking about?
I want to give that question to Alex, but I want to just stick for a second on what you're saying about the sort of psychic structure of the fait accompli, right? Because, and again, I said I would talk about Fanon, right? Fanon's got this broad distinction that says,
this is a safe space to talk about Fanon, comrade.
It says ideology and hegemony is for Europe and the Europeans, force is for the colonies, right? But at the same time, that distinction, it's very important, right? That, it's always easier and more legitimate to use force in the global South or the South of the North, whether it's Black or brown communities in the U.S. But at the same time, that breaks down immediately because, he also says that the colonizer wants to get into the head of the colonized, right? Get into the brain in precisely in this way, right? To impose an understanding that there's nothing you can do. There's an impossibility, right? For Fanon, that leads into a conversation about the role of force in history, where he's talking about Engels, he's talking about Engels' critique of Dühring, and he's critiquing both of them, right? Because the fait accompli used to be that they would roll tanks in and massive firepower into the colony and say, look, there's nothing you can do about this, right? And then a bunch of sort of aspiring native elites will say, look, there's nothing we can do about it. Fanon says these are losers from the start. His indication that we can do something about it is Dien Bien Phu, right? Is the fact that guerrilla struggle resets the terms of force, right? Resets the meaning of force and reminds us that force is not in material, like Engels' argument, right? Force lies in material economic production of those weapons, right? Force lies in something very different. Numbers, knowledge of terrain, resolve, right? The psychic capacity to fight back, right? This willingness and dedication to fight back. All right, and I say all that, maybe that's sort of unnecessary to say, but I say that, all that to say, that's not what's happening here. They're not rolling tanks into the streets of Caracas and saying, you can't fight back, give up your, give up, right? They snuck into the country for 2 hours and then snuck back out, right? And the only structure of the fait accompli has to do with Maduro and Celia Flores, which is to say, they're gone, right? There's nothing you can do about it, right? Nothing else, right? So it's very, very interesting that this is how modest, again, the most powerful military in the world has to be in this moment. I think that's revealing.
Yeah, I think that's really important, particularly because they're bragging about it. Like, what are you bragging about? I mean, they mobilized 150 warplanes. I don't know how many ships that have been, blockading Venezuela for months now, who have extrajudicially executed more than 110 people in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. They mobilized all these resources, all that money to do, as Geo said, a 2-hour operation in which they snuck in. According to some Venezuelan sources, they executed the security detail in cold blood. And then we don't know if the U.S. suffered any sort of casualties. They can't say that anyway, right? As both of you have mentioned, because again, that kind of undermines the premise of the projection of force that they're trying to demonstrate in this. They snuck in and they snuck out, and they're celebrating that as somehow that's a big military victory. I mean, I think that's really important. I think to keep that in mind, that's what it took to accomplish, again, like a gangster operation, like led by special operators, which is a very recent, more or less recent 9/11, war on terror kind of stuff that we can also keep in mind. But I think some of the things so I think Gio's right on. I think some of the things to keep in mind right now, and this is from that distinction that Fanon makes, right? That the colonies get force and the people inside the metropole get ideology and hegemony. That's with obvious differences, particularly in the domestic sense, where we now see that the deployment of ICE and Border Patrol throughout the country, because the entire United States is a border, right? So whether you're a migrant or not, if you express anti-imperial ideas, like the young woman in Michigan did a couple of days ago, she got arrested on air while she was being interviewed because she was against U.S. empire, right? So the force is being deployed, obviously, domestically. But nonetheless, we need to push back against what Walter Rodney refers to kind of funnily in the preface to How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, where he's like, I'm not going to say that all the work in this, all the mistakes in this book are my own and none of the people who helped me. He's like, nah, that's like bourgeois subjectivism. So I think we need to refute bourgeois subjectivism and resist any of these calls. And I think there's been really funny responses to this call to listen to quote unquote Venezuelan voices. And Geo, you've done a really good job online of addressing that impulse within the United States, right? Like, if you're not Venezuelan, you're not allowed to opine on what just happened. But obviously they're not talking about all Venezuelans. They're talking about certain Venezuelans who are expressing certain thoughts. And Gio's been waging this online war against these Gusano tendencies for a long time. I think that's how we met on Twitter back in the early 2010s, right? You going after somebody and me having a
Same
good time.
here.
Golden days of Twitter.
Yeah. And then the other thing also, obviously we can talk about Celia Flores and Nicolás Maduro. That's important. But again, I think there's a bigger concept at play here. And the bigger concept is the idea of national sovereignty in Latin America and the Caribbean, and whether Latin America, past and present, has the ability to exercise national sovereignty. I mean, I think this is what we've seen a constant U.S. violation of in Venezuela since at least like 2000, 2001, right? So this gangster operation that led in the abduction of Nicolás Maduro has its recent precedent in the myriad forms of overt and covert economic and military techniques that the U.S. has enacted to try to undermine the Bolivarian project, even as they were distracted or their attention was focused elsewhere in the 2000s, particularly in West Asia. So I think we come back to that, right? Like this is about why does the U.S. why is the U.S. able to wield extraterritorially its bullshit anti-narcotics drug laws, primarily when they're the world's largest narco state. They always have been, and they've always used drug policy to go at countries that they deem to be enemies, while their allies who are actually trafficking drugs, well, they're allowed to do that because they're running drugs for the White House. So I think those are some of the things that we need to keep in mind. I always come back to the question of sovereignty. And one of the reasons why Venezuela is suffering and has suffered, there's all sorts of internal contradictions that we can talk about. I've learned, I mean, Geo knows this, I've learned a lot of what's been going on, some of the internal contradictions within the Bolivarian project from his own work. But externally, I mean, again, this is about the concept of sovereignty and why historically the U.S. has deemed exercises of sovereignty and self-determination in Latin America as intolerable or as antithetical to their own interests. And this is what exposes it to be an empire in the region and globally.
And Alex, I mean, Alex knows perfectly well, right, that one of the new aspects of this is the use. It's not completely new, right? But one of the novel pieces is the way that narco trafficking is being used, right? That's something that, Alex has written on and, knows perfectly well about in Mexico in particular, right? About the ways in which claims of fighting narco trafficking were actually used to fight insurgents, right? And they're going to Gary Webb you at some point if you keep revealing the fact that, the U.S. is actually.
Wait, not me. They're not going to Gary Webb me. Don't say that, Gio.
They're gonna fucking, but this shit has a long history, right? And it's it's different pretexts, it's different arguments. I don't know, Alex, what do you think in terms of the degree to which we're seeing? Because I see the 80s as very revealing in this sense, right? The Central American wars, the use of the language of a war on drugs, right, and a war on terror actually joined together. The potential for, and I think about it in part in terms of the potential for the Democrats to actually block funding to Venezuela is key, right? For folks to know this is the source of Iran-Contra, is that the Democrats are blocking U.S. funding of the Contra war in Nicaragua. And so I don't know if we're going to see that kind of scenario. So I'd be curious, Alex, how you see the Mexico, Central America, Venezuela piece playing out today.
I think one thing we should also keep in mind is that a lot of what Trump and his people are doing now regarding Venezuela is for domestic consumption. And I think that's the terrain on which the charges of narco-terrorism has operated on for U.S. empire. Like thinking about how can we galvanize U.S. domestic political support for all the fuckery that we do in Latin America? Well, anti-communism in the 80s starts to give way a little bit, right? It starts to give way. Someone like this ghoul, Elliot Abrams, is already writing in the mid 80s, who actually I'm reading like an op-ed that Ross Douthat just published today in the New York Times. It's titled "In Defense of U.S. Intervention in Venezuela." And they're like, let's interview Elliot fucking Abrams. Anyway, so Elliot Abrams by the mid 80s is already writing about how we need like a new justifying framework for U.S. intervention in Latin America. Anti-communism doesn't have the power that it once did. So we're going to use narco-terrorism. And actually narco-terrorism as a concept was developed by a historian who was here at ASU. I never got a chance to meet him, Louis Tams, who had been a member of the Committee of Santa Fe, which is like one of these predecessors to the neocons. They wrote a really famous manifesto in 1980 that then became kind of like the center of Reaganite foreign policy. He also was and this, I think his life story and career kind of encapsulates the contradictions of the U.S. using narco-terrorism as a justifying imperial framework. He was actually ambassador to Colombia in the early 80s, and he was also ambassador to Costa Rica when he was actually helping the Southern Front Contras wage their horrific covert war against the Sandinistas, right? But he's also the guy who came up with the term narco-terrorism to deploy against enemies of U.S. empire in the Americas. So the Sandinistas in the 80s were the ones who were actually trafficking cocaine as part of a international shadowy network that began in the Kremlin, but that mobilized the Sandinistas, the Cubans, the PLO got thrown in there as well. Gaddafi gets thrown in there as well. So, and that chart, that framework of narco-terrorism becomes really useful in the unipolar moment in the 1990s, right? There is no more communism, right? So what's a justifying framework what's a framework that can be used domestically to galvanize political support for continued U.S. domination of Latin America? What's the narco-terrorism, right? And that kind of culminates in Plan Colombia in the late 90s, who Joe Biden famously took credit as being like the principal architect, right? The idea that they were going to help Colombia wage a war on drugs with billions of dollars in funding and military support. Actuality is a war against the left in Colombia. It was a war against the guerrilla left, and it was a war against the non-violent left in Colombia. We're still dealing. I mean, that country's still dealing with the fallout. There's a reason why Hugo Chavez referred to Colombia as the Israel of Latin America, and that's a lot of it has to do with the kind of military and political buildup that Plan Colombia represented. So I think that's why I think we see the narco-terrorism thing kind of come back, right? The war on terror kind of framework doesn't work as well in Latin America. They've tried, right? They've said since the mid 2000s that all these pink tide governments were somehow involved with Hezbollah, with Iran. They said that now, right? That's part of I've seen Mike Waltz, the UN's U.S. ambassador the U.S. ambassador to UN say this. Little Narco Rubio has said it. Stephen Miller has said it, that we can't allow Venezuela to become a playground for Iran and Hezbollah, right? So I think that's kind of the narco-terrorism framework, I think, is directed more toward political domestic consumption. But even then, I don't think it's like working, but we'll see.
But both these things that you're saying, Alex, and then Geo had said about, are creating identifications, I think, like socio-politically, affectively. None of this stuff is innocent, whether you're saying listen to Venezuelans or narco-terrorists or any one of these things. And for me, that's how the sovereignty piece links up, right? Because when you create identifications, particularly for US Americans to sort of latch onto affectively, you're also coercing a disidentification. And who are you disidentifying from? It's the folks on the ground. You're sort of psychically curating and orienting people in a particular way. I think that's really important. That's part of the PSYOPs. Like you said, Gio, I mean, there was a movement away in terms of PSYOPs, and they write about this really directly. It's like it becomes a culture war. You can't do the military stuff anymore, so let's do the PSYOPs piece of it. But those identifications are really important because when you're thinking about it, disrupts this idea, just like Fanon had said, and Gio, you sort of laid this out for us, which is always important to bring in Fanon, so don't ever apologize for that. But the important piece of this is that it lays the groundwork for folks then to consciously or unconsciously believe that those folks on the ground actually cannot, right, rise up and be with it enough to exact self-determination and sovereignty. And we see this. I mean, it's racism 101, but this is also an arm of the state to make people identify. And that's where this like weirdo identity politics of like white Venezuelan, like listen to them. Again, nothing innocent about that because it immediately writes out everybody else. I'm not hearing anybody saying, listen to the leftists in the street who have their fucking weapons and are protecting their homeland. Right.
Yeah, and I think we should talk about this piece, right? The very first comment on your post about this conversation was like, why not have some Venezuelans on? I'm just like, cool, like I'm fine. Like in the abstract, it's like I don't give a shit, have some fucking Venezuelans on. But in the reality, the question is, it's a deferral, right? It's a punt. Like you're not asking the actual question, which is who, right? Which Venezuelans, and built into it is the idea that that somehow what this conversation will reflect does not reflect some other reality kind of out there.
Or it's less credible. Like somehow you too with your politics are less credible.
And this is like the absolute fucking cesspool of liberalism and the way that liberalism has recrafted and, elite captured identity politics, right? To use Femi Tagwa's kind of, frame, right? Which is to say, you don't care about whether it's Venezuelans or not. You actually care about a certain kind of politics, but you're willing to sort of leverage this kind of piece. And the reality is, again, a long time being the white dude talking about Venezuela, so I don't give a shit, right? It does not bother me. Living in Venezuela is very funny because people will be like, "Oh, are you a fucking CIA spy? Ha ha ha! No, you're not. Okay, let's go talk about this." And so it really desensitizes you to that kind of piece, right? But you also realize when you're in Venezuela that the very structure of society, and this is shifted and transformed, but like historically speaking, the very structure of society was one in which the society was very, very divided, right? Very, very polarized. Again, very important point. Studying Venezuela makes it clear that polarization is not a bad thing. We talk about polarization all the time. Again, dialectics operates through a polarization that then sets things into motion. Is it in motion is the question, and that's what has been and was kind of happening. But this sort of very polarized society means that people on an epistemological level just understand the world in very different ways, right? And the structure of exclusion, and this is, I think, where the colonial and racial exclusion on top of the class exclusion becomes very, very important, right? Because their deep psychic trauma of Chavismo for the opposition is that all of a sudden there was opposition. All of a sudden there was what they called hatred. All of a sudden they hate us. What they meant was that these people who were so thoroughly excluded from society as to not exist suddenly existed, right? And they were looking at them and they were judging them, right? And they had to look at this person who didn't look white in power, right? And so this was a deeply psychically traumatic thing that sort of began to fragment their sort of epistemological closure that they had. And, I made this argument a long time ago, which is to say, rich people lived in rich areas. They never fucking went to the poor areas, right? Poor people lived in poor areas and went to work in the rich areas. So it's actually poor people, and this is probably universal, who actually understand the totality of how society operates and the way that it's unified and what dynamics, right? Who can grasp the totality, and it's not the rich people who self-exclude and refuse to understand it. So, I mean, that's all to say, like, there's a reason that rich white Venezuelans don't fucking understand their own society, right? Because they choose not to, because they're taught not to, especially when they leave the country. They definitely don't. They've never tried to, and they don't care to, right? That doesn't mean that anyone has absolute and pure and sort of like perfect understanding of that reality. But it does mean we need to ask those questions about who we're talking to, who we're listening to.
Before we go to you, Alex, I just want to give a shout out to Jay from Millennials, Arcane Capitalism in the chat. And he also has a live stream today at 5 p.m. So make sure you check that out. Go ahead.
I think both points are really important. One, I mean, this is one of the things I think I struggle the most, like actually in the upcoming semester, I'm teaching a Latin American revolutions class. And one of the challenges for me teaching about revolutionary projects is to go beyond that disidentification that U.S. empire produces inside the metropole, right? So how do I get American students from all different backgrounds to somehow identify with the struggles of Central American peasants, right, in the 1970s and 80s, to like not implement some sort of like Bolshevik communist dictatorship, but to resist death squads to create a better country? And in many instances, they were motivated by like liberation theology, right? So how do you, and this is something that U.S. empire has done. And then I've learned this from our comrade Nick Estes, right? From the very beginning, U.S. empire depends on massive amounts of racism and rendering inhumane the enemies of U.S. empire. And one of the ways they do that is to say, oh, such and such person does not value life the way that we value life. And they've done, I mean, there's like, you can find quotes from like different, from the Lakotas, about Lakota people, to Brett Stevens talking about Arabs during the War on Terror, right? It's always the same message. These people don't value life like we do. They are one-dimensional. They are violent irrationally, and therefore that kind of justifies intervention, genocide, immense amounts of mass destruction. And we see this with Palestine. That's like the paradigmatic case, I think, of the last 10, 20 years. So how do we get people within the U.S. empire to kind of move away from that disidentification, to see these people as actual human beings that actually have more in common with us than we have with our decrepit, diseased rulers, who may or may not have launched kidnapping operations because of dancing, and they didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Who knows? So, I think that the point that Geo is making is really important too. I remember that famous documentary that was made about the coup against Chávez, "The Revolution Will Not Be Will Be Televised." I can't remember the title of it, but there's a striking scene. Well, not right. There's a striking scene that I always show my classes, where there's kind of like a wealthy homeowner association, like apartment meeting, and the whole meeting is about, we need to now surveil and pay attention to our darker skinned, lower class domestic servants, because they are all Chavistas, and they've actually been infiltrating our intimate private spheres, and they're probably armed to the teeth, and they probably want to take us out. So how do we organize against that? That's what Chavez's presidential election in the late 90s, that's kind of that type of thinking is what triggered this type of reaction, right? Like Geo is saying, these rich, I mean, Geo can talk about this more, the way that just like physically and geographically, a city of Caracas is like, it embodies these type of racial and class differences in the actual physicality of it. But like what finally got rich white Venezuelans to like actually see and recognize to a certain level racialized working class populations in the country was when someone like that looked like them won political power. Yeah. And then it's from like a position of fear. Yeah. Right? Because now they're saying we're losing all sorts of social privilege. It's not even about like just the material privileges they're going to lose, but it's also like the social deference and privileges they're going to lose that really freak them out.
And to be feared, it's phenomenal, right? To be feared is always better than to be pitied, right? Yes. Pity is a structure of power directed at you. Fear is a structure of not reciprocity, but something that approaches reciprocity, right? There's the blockage of the Hegelian dialectic that Fanon seeks to overcome through an explosive resort to something that provokes something like fear as a proto kind of recognition. And this, right? And if you watch that scene, everyone should still watch The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. There's these great Irish filmmakers who are accidentally embedded during a coup. They follow around the government. They see they collect this other footage in this homeowners association in the east of the city, in the wealthy areas. They're also talking about boiling oil to pour down from the rooftops when what they used to at that point call the Tupamaros sort of invaded their kind of neighborhoods. But what's very interesting for me is that like when they say our domestics are spying on us, and they're not fucking lying either, right? And this is part of what I talk about a lot in the Anti-Colonial Eruptions book, right? Which is the fact that, like, historically speaking, this is the cunning power of poor and oppressed and racialized people, which is that they can enter into spaces, and because the structure of power and racial power in particular dehumanizes them, it dehumanizes them to such a degree that they can't actually be agents capable of doing anything. So you have the US Civil War, Black domestic workers spying and memorizing war plans in the offices of the Confederate leadership and then bringing them back to the sort of Union Army, right? This is rife, right? And you have these moments of conflict where where it comes to the surface and people get very, very worried. So slave owners will start to speak French. And there's this quote from a slave owner in the US South that said, "We're speaking French against Africa," right? Basically, like, we are speaking French so that our domestic workers can't hear and spy on us. But they know this is a vulnerability because they built a material structure, and their psychic structure blinds them to it, right? This sort of what I call the colonial blind spot, and then the material structures that they can't live without this work. They can't live without this labor, right? They require it, and that's a constant kind of Achilles heel of colonial and racial power. And the material piece, I think, is really important, right? On the disidentification piece, I think, and maybe this is a very crude reading of what disidentification means, but I think it's important to understand that it's also like also a material project, right? And you brought up Nick Estes, Alex. And here's someone who's a great sort of revolutionary indigenous leader in the US, but who was partly radicalized by the fact that his sort of indigenous community starts to receive free heating oil from Venezuela when he's younger, right? And sees that and begins to wonder, wait, what's happening, right? So already kind of disidentified with US empire in a certain way, but then the possibility of an identification with another, kind of way of looking at the world and another political process begins, right? And someone was asking me in this sort of Facebook Q&A of like, what were the dividends of all of that work done by Citgo, done by Chávez to sort of distribute heating oil again to the Bronx, to indigenous communities, to poor communities in the US, the offer of emergency support after Katrina, the, offer of sort of free education, all these kinds of things, and I don't know what it means in the long term, but there was a process of facilitating an identification with what was happening in Venezuela, right? That was when solidarity was very, very powerful, because I think that they did kind of break that kind of psychic blockade and create the possibility of particularly historically oppressed communities, right? In the US, in New York, who had a reference point of sort of Malcolm and Fidel, who had a reference point for thinking outside of the US boundaries and in an internationalist way, and we're able to do that. And so that is a material process that then has to be broken, right? And it's broken in part by very material forces, right? the seizure of Citgo more recently being the most important one, but already the crisis was making that, had blocked the possibility of that kind of redistribution.
Alex, there was some question about who coined the term narcoterrorism.
Oh, yeah, it was Louis Tams, so Lewis Tams, Tambs. I mean, there's wild stories about him when he was here at ASU. Like he would never stand next to a window because he said like the Medellin cartel was trying to take him out. So he was so
they didn't do a very good job.
No, well, no, it's also kind of like the product of doing imperial work is he got to finish out his tenured career at ASU fearing that he was going to get taken out by Pablo Escobar hired sicarios. I think I don't know, that says something. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's the psychic state of siege, right? that they're constantly under. But I think this goes back to what you all were discussing. And, for this to work, though, the racism, all of that, one of the things you all are laying out is what I might call a psychic inversion. It relies on that. You have to constantly invert who the oppressor is, who the oppressed is. But it's a constant process. It can't be a one and done thing. It's a repetitive process, which is why we see the sort of portable logic constantly, whether it's in Palestine or Venezuela or anywhere else. The portable logic of this or internal island is that the psychic inversions have to be constantly fed, right? That we're the ones who are actually under attack. It's our values that are under attack. They're the ones, I think this is part of what the disidentifications work on, but also who's afforded the interior complexity. Like this is, I think, fundamentally what it's based on is who's able to have internal resources enough to, number one, like you were saying, be able to be quote unquote smart enough to self-rule, be smart enough to figure out all these things, as though, and this is the thing that comes back to it, like, I'm not impressed by brute force. Anybody can fucking come in and murder an entire, security detail. And like that, if all of us worked like that, which is what the projection is, of course, about leftist movements, that you come in and you just use, this is back to Fanon, just completely unbridled violence to do anything you want. And it's really empire that does that, or it's really the Zionist entity that does that, can drop 8,000-ton bombs in a residential area and then say, oh, see, look how smart we are, or look how strong we are, right? But maybe this is a good segue also to Zionism, because Netanyahu had this, and how this is all imbricated in all of this, and empire, of course, plays a part in it. Netanyahu had this talk that he gave, I think, in the Knesset, where he said something like, finally Latin America is rejoining the American axis, and of course, then that also means Israel, right? I'm seeing a lot of people sort of speculate around what's happening, but what is your sense, both of you, of how these things come together?
Yeah, I mean, Alex has a lot to say about this.
No, I mean, I just think that, listen, I mean, it's no accident why. No, it's no accident why most of the Latin American right, when they're out in the streets marching, they're waving Israeli flags, right? I mean, there's talking about identification, I guess, on that level. I mean, again, this is going to be unoriginal for a historian to say. There's a long history, there's a long past about this, but I think it's very clear. I mean, I think the sides or the lines of conflict are clearly drawn, right? Like there's a pro-genocide and there's an anti-genocide side. So obviously Netanyahu is on the pro-genocide side, and he's worked to cultivate allies in Latin America to join his side, right? And he's gotten Javier Milei, this insane president of Venezuela, who's probably the most right now after Bolsonaro, kind of the biggest, the most emblematic representatives of what Zionism has cultivated in Latin America. In Colombia, there's a long, shady history of the Israelis training right-wing military death squad, paramilitary death squads, selling weapons to Colombia, I mean, pretty much I've written about this before, but every like right-wing death squad or military dictatorship during the Cold War and after has at one point received Israeli military training and or weapons. This claim that we've heard since October 7th, 2023, that was the largest number of Jewish casualties since the Holocaust. No, that was actually during the Argentine military dictatorship. and Israel was sending the most anti-Semitic, virulently anti-Semitic of the South American military dictatorships that took power. They were explicitly anti-Semitic. They had, there's a colonel or a general once identified the three main enemies of Argentina as being like Karl Marx, Albert Einstein, and Sigmund Freud, right? Because they all challenged Christian concepts of time, space, and history on some level. But they received, Israel was selling them weapons as they were, murdering, disappearing, torturing thousands of Argentine Jews. The famous cases of Jacobo Tiberman, who wrote a testimony about this called Prisoner Without a Name, Cell Without a Number, something. I'm butchering the title of his memoir, but he's one of he provided one of the testimonies that talked about how when he was being tortured, it was being done under like portraits of Hitler and Argentine security officers like saluting to portraits of Hitler and other Nazi regalia, right? So Zionism has long had a counterinsurgent death squad genocidal role in Latin America, and that's not even without getting into like what they did in Guatemala in the early 80s, which is the genocide of Mayan peoples. So, but now I think since what we've seen is it's one of these lines of demarcation in Latin America that we've seen since Al-Aqsa flood, right? Like it's your anti-genocide, you're pro-Palestinian resistance, you believe in a people's ability and right to resist tyranny and to exercise self-determination for the achievement of national sovereignty, or you support the pro-genocide side. And this is one more line of demarcation in the region.
Yeah. And, I'll start with the last thing Laura was talking about and circle back to this a little bit, because, so you've got this, what you call the lack of internal complexity, right? This colonial racial understanding that colonized non-white people are, the fundamental piece is they're incapable of self-government, right? This is the sort of fundamental colonial logic, right? They're incapable of self-government, but they're also incapable of many other things, right? You see this in the history of even things like the concept of revolution, right? The concept of revolution has to be saved after the French Revolution, but at the same time, it has to be, it becomes very, very racialized in the context of the Haitian Revolution. So you have the emergence of and an uptick in insurgency, insurrection, rebellion, riot. All of these words that we hear are racialized terms. They emerge in a racialized way to explain the actions of people who don't have a concept of a new society, right? Which is what revolution eventually involves to kind of like retain and preserve, right? So in other words, colonized and non-white people are incapable of revolution, but they are capable of all these very destructive, irrational kind of acts, right? Just a riot. So you have that. At the same time, and there, of course, this is central to the colonial logic, the victim logic that emerges as you kind of rightly identified. But it also has, and I always want to emphasize this, it always has, it provides cover for a whole range of strategic advantages, right? Which is the fact that very little is expected of colonized and racialized people. Yeah. There's very, very often you see the shock when people do the thing, like make a revolution in Haiti, right? The unthinkability of the Haitian Revolution comes precisely from the fact that they're doing the thing that conceptually is impossible for them to do, right?
That's what Al-Aqsa flood was too.
That's the point, right? This is exactly it, right? I have this thing coming out right now to say like this was an anti-colonial eruption, right? October 7th, right? The inability, and you see this through even the narratives of the IDF and its intelligence services, the systematic estimation of Palestinian resistance forces is what makes October 7th possible, right? The colonial blind spot that says they're not capable of really doing something like this, or something this well organized, or something this well thought out, infects forces of domination, right? And it's always there. They can try to keep on top of it, but because of the racial logic, they always lose it, right? That's why, and the first time I thought about this was in Venezuela. So all the pieces are connected, right? Because everyone on the, sort of elite white sectors of Venezuelan society were absolutely shocked by the mass rebellions of 1989 against neoliberalism. But there's no reason to be shocked, right? 60% of the population was living in poverty. There were, absolutely mass suffering in the streets. What had happened was, again, this sort of closure of sort of psychic segregation and geographic segregation of the city to say, those people don't matter. We don't ever see them. They're not part of society. All of a sudden, they burst into reality. They burst into being, and it's shocking, right? And so the question is always, why are they shocked? The question of the coup in 2002 against Chavez is, why are they, when you see the way the coup in 2002 played out, the hubris, the colonial hubris was on full display, because they said, we woke up, this is very famous journalist, started his daily broadcasts and he said, you know, hoy amanecemos con un nuevo Venezuela, or something like that. It's like we now wake up with a new Venezuela. They brought the coup leaders on TV. They talked about how they did it. They talked about the coup. They talked about how they planned it. They scrapped the Constitution. They dismantled the Supreme Court. And within 48 hours, they had been thrown back out of power by the people, right? Because they thought it was a fait accompli, right? They thought it was a done deal, and they understood, and they underestimated in a dramatic way the people. That is always the advantage that we have, right? And that's, you know, part of the absolute hubris of this operation, you know, in Venezuela today. I think, you know, we can look towards some of those same advantages and same resources on the ground.
Yeah, because I think, and I've learned this from Geo's work and others. I mean, it's a structural element of colonial or rule or domination. Like, you can't get around that blind spot. You don't have that everyday implementation of domination without having that blind spot, because there's more of us than them, right? Like, they have to get around that demographic number. I love sharing with.
They're also constitutively misattuned away from that.
They have to be right, because they also have to, like, how do you reconceptualize domination for something that is not, right? Like, if that makes any sense. Like, how do you deal with the fact that, like, your livelihood or your position in a particular society is premised on the massive exploitation of peoples that exist in larger numbers than yourself, right? I mean, I love when I teach the Haitian Revolution, I love sharing like these like slave owner testimony letters that they were writing with my students that were writing on the eve of revolution in August of 1791, where they're like, oh, my quote unquote Negroes are happy. They could never imagine things like liberation or freedom. They're just happy in their day-to-day existence. Goes to what Geo was talking about. And that's why I think globally, I would make the argument, but especially for Latin America, that's why the Haitian Revolution is so important politically, theoretically, and historically. But you see that in every revolutionary project in Latin America. The revolution involves a degree of shock by the ruler. They cannot believe that this is happening, even though in retrospect, for those of us who are students of history or whatever, it's obvious, as Geo mentioned, right? It's obvious when you think about the levels of exploitation, political, socioeconomic inequality, who's allowed the levers of power and who's not. There's newspaper articles from during the Mexican Revolution where these Mexico City newspapers are talking about the Zapatistas, and they're like, how do we defeat a force where a platoon of soldiers march by and they see this like humble, hardworking peasant, and as soon as they turn their back on him, he puts down his plow, picks up a rifle, and he shoots them. Like, it's always that degree of, they cannot believe that the poors, the people who used to always be deferential to them socially, are now capable of disrupting that relationship to wage revolution. And I think this is really important. Go ahead, Joe.
No, I was gonna say, this is always built into, like, it's very much tied to the sort of guilty conscience piece, right? Because on the one hand, when we say the operation is necessary, right? The psychic operation is necessary to convince them that what they're doing is not actually what they're doing, right? Exactly. They're not actually enslaving human beings, extracting their labor, dehumanizing them, murdering them, right? So on a certain level, that's a psychic preservation they have to engage in that produces this dramatic guilty conscience, right? And again, you see it very clearly under all colonial sort of domination, but you also see it very clearly under slavery, which is to say, these are not real human beings, therefore we can enslave them, but we're always suspicious that they might actually be human beings, right? Because deep down, something is going on, right? And so you have, on the one hand, the slaves are happy, and on the other hand, they might rise up and kill us at any moment, right? Yeah. And this sort of fear, versus, and it's always this process of managing it that goes up and down, throughout history. It ebbs and flows. It becomes very, very, very contradictory. And the suspicion always points to sort of the contradiction. And the contradiction is one of humanity, right? The guilty conscience of what you're doing, right? Colonialism does this as well. You see this in trials, right? The trial of slave insurgents, right? Which is to say, people who are not understood as humans or legal subjects, legally responsible subjects, are put on trial for doing this thing, which admits that they're human legal subjects at the same time that it's trying to sort of contain their rebellion, right? So it's a contradiction that's constantly sort of, just below the surface, right? And as you put it, Black Jacobins, CLR James says, the colonists slept on the edge of Vesuvius and they didn't know it until it was too late, right? That's it, and that's why I talk about volcanoes. That's why I talk about the because when you say that the Haitian Revolution is a volcano, when you say Palestine is a volcano, you can see that everywhere. The language is sort of like rife with volcanic metaphors. It's because you couldn't see it coming, right? Something about your own psychic structure prevented you from understanding it. And just to sort of, make this point very, very clearly, this is why class reduction doesn't explain anything, right? This is because class is a much more legible category, right? A strike is a much more visible, legible category. We're talking about structures that are grounded in invisibility, and this emerges in a class context, right? Bosses and capitalists underestimate the power of workers, yes, but not onto the level of illegibility and invisibility that colonial structures do, right? You can't understand the shock at the Venezuelan rebellion of 1989 on just a class basis. You have to understand it on the level of something that operates through invisibility and dehumanization. That's incredibly
But that's why disruption, like Alex was saying before, is so important, and the ability for folks and the poor and working class indigenous people to engage in disruption, because settler colonialism, all those sorts of things, that contradiction, it's not like it's worked through, it's actually doubled down on. And that's the difference, right? When Fanon says that colonialism is not a thinking machine, there's a sort of conscious and unconscious reification over and over and over again of that dominance, of exploitation, of everything of dominance, right? Because there is no such thing as ideology light. You're not just like, oh, I just half-ass believe this. You have to every single fucking day prove that you are that. So for me, what you all are sort of drawing out for us is the necessity of antagonism, right? And on every level, yes, there's asymmetrical warfare that's happening, but I'm thinking also for us, as we see this play out, just like we've been seeing over the past 2 years with the genocide in Palestine, with every other uprising, there's multiple uprisings in the world happening right now. And that's not by chance that this is happening at this inflection moment when people are when kind of the veil is like, there's no pretense anymore to what this colonial logic that you're talking about, Geo, is doing. But I think the antagonism, us being aware of the contradictions and pushing upon those seams and really sort of supporting the folks on the ground who are doing that in really important ways, for me, that feels really important, because again, back to Fanon, colonizers cede nothing for free, altruistically. That's never the way that it's going to happen, right? Because they are committed actually to their fascistic or dominating or extractive ideologies.
And I just want to say very quickly, this is maybe just a very small point. The doubling down is real, right?
Yeah.
The language of the slaves are happy increases as slavery enters into crisis, increases as resistance, because it's necessary, right? When they have to say, you can say that the resort to force is the crisis of hegemony and ideology, yes, also. But the resort to constant reiteration of the ideology is also a symptom of the
United States is de facto the dominant hegemonic force in the world and is ruling Venezuela.
No, but again, this gets back to oh, look how great this operation was. Look how successful it was. Look at our military force. Look at our military force. Look at our, they're saying it over and over again because it is in question and in crisis.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think also a thought that I had going back to Geo's point about earlier, right? That the colonized or the oppressed or the wretched of the earth, because of their everyday material conditions, they see domination for what it is, right? And they know their rulers much better than the rulers know them by necessity, right? And this is why I thought of the example from pre-revolutionary Haiti, and you see this in other slaveholding regimes as well, that one of the methods of resistance that slaves use that really hit on that hinge point between slave owner anxiety and confidence in their position of power was poisoning, right? The idea of your own domestic slave having the space, the ability and the space and the access to you to poison you because they're the ones feeding you. And then there's always a degree of uncertainty, right? Because how did this person die? Was it really poisoned or not? I think that's from CLR James, right? That really exposes that at bottom, what is a particular form of anxiety that's built into these systems of domination. And one thing I think that we can connect it to what Geo just said is that's part of I think that helps us see a little bit of why we have to continuously see the iteration and the reiteration of their power and their overwhelming force and the attempt to convince us and other people, particularly in the Americas, that there is nothing you can do to challenge US power. Like this, you cannot do anything to prevent what we just did to Venezuela. And it's just this constant and you see that's one of the challenges that's being thrown up to other Latin American countries right now. Like, what are you going to do about it? Now you're being threatened by Cuba is being threatened. Colombia is being threatened. Mexico is being threatened. So in the face of this allegedly invincible US military machine, like they're being told to just to not resist. They're being told to just do whatever Trump wants them to do, which is also like the ask is also very contradictory and incoherent, which makes it even more difficult. But it's all about convincing these peoples that like this empire and this military machine is invincible. When in reality, we know that that's not the case, right? And in reality, the fact that they have to continuously remind us of that, again, to go back to what we were discussing at the very beginning, is a type of weakness in and of itself.
I want to get to Maduro and why it's important what he said in court. But somebody in the chat just said, was Freud a commie? He is now. He's Abu Furaida. No, he was not a commie, folks. But I'm wondering if you both have just commentary on him in general and why it was important. I feel like to the point of truth telling, of staying on point, for him to say, I consider myself a prisoner of war, as the statement that he says, and the rightful president of Venezuela and all these sorts of things. But if I don't know if you all have any thoughts about that, or if there's anything else you can offer folks that are listening about the importance of any of this.
I don't know, but like maybe y'all can help me figure this out. I have no fucking idea why Trump decided to give him this opportunity to be in court. Like, I don't understand. Like, I'm going to be totally fucking honest. I thought we were going to be looking at targeted assassinations in Venezuela. I did not think that Trump was going to create a situation. This is the other, again, we
spectacle.
We need to look at and understand the ways that, power is not powerful, that power is bound up in a whole range of weakness, right? And this is one of them, right? The feeling that you have to then bring him to court creates, it's going to be a fucking zoo. It's already a zoo outside of the courthouse, right? And it's a zoo that has forced, for example, mainstream news outlets to say, oh, like there's Venezuelans on both sides of this thing, right? There's Venezuelans from both political perspectives. There's people who are opposed to this, right? You've got a judge who will be able to do something like dismiss bullshit charges because they're bullshit charges. How are you going to charge a foreign head of state with the possession of machine guns? What the fuck does that mean, right? Much less the bizarre claims about narco trafficking. And part of me is like, oh, like they'll manage to convict him of something. But I'm like looking at the charges, it's like, what the fuck could they convict him of, right? And so like, could you imagine a situation in which this judge is like, oh no, these charges are all bullshit. I order these people to be released, right? Like, not that I expect that to happen, but where we exist in a moment in a situation in which there's a fragmentation on the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has actually been to me at least a little bit surprisingly willing to say, no, this is illegal, this is illegal, this is illegal. And that's creating a contradiction and the possibility and the opportunity for, again, not a good outcome, but an absolutely chaotic outcome for Trump.
Even if they have to equivocate like the Hamas, right? But he's a dictator, but this was illegal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, Maduro could draw on a very famous legal case and courtroom speech from the early 1950s in Cuba, right? Which is it's come down as one of the more, I think, famous instances of someone who's put on trial, turning it around on the entire system that put him on trial to begin with, and allowed him the opportunity to indict that system and then to valorize and elevate, universalist revolutionary principles, primarily the natural right of any peoples to resist tyranny. And I'm talking about Fidel Castro's famous "History Will Absolve Me" courtroom speech. I mean, I think Joe's right. I think this could give Maduro and his legal team the opportunity to put this entire system that brought him to New York on trial, as opposed to him, particularly because if you've read the indictment, it's so thin, it's so shady, it's so contradictory. There's no mention of fentanyl. There's no mention of El Cartel de los Soles. Why? Because as we've been saying for a long time, it does not exist. When it did exist, it was a CIA-run operation in the late 80s and early 90s. I mean, so what is he being charged with? Allegedly being involved in some way, shape, or form in cocaine trafficking since the late 1990s. Mm-hmm. That's already highly problematic. The second one, I think we mentioned that he had illegal machine guns. Like, but also the other thing, and this again goes to the incoherence and contradictions of someone like Trump I think as a weak political leader, is that in terms of legal strategy, it looks like Maduro's lawyers are going to pursue or thinking about pursuing the argument that he's a head of state, and being a head of state guarantees you a certain degree of legal immunity. And the fact that Trump continuously refers to him as President Maduro, it's like all you have to do is enter into the record all these like tweets and speeches and whatever. And then like, what is this judge going to do? Like if this judge then and the prosecutors follow the law, right, as theoretically they should, then where does this case go? I mean, it's a very weak case.
And also we're talking about context.
Good.
No, I was saying context in which it's not the only case, right? Luigi Mangione is on trial, right? We're talking about a context in which full-on hegemonic crisis is leading to a situation in which people are seeing people commit acts of violence against the system and saying, you know what, that doesn't sound so bad to me, right? And if we're talking about identification and disidentification, people are identifying with Luigi, and like everyday people, not leftists, right? And I was one of the people who's like, I don't give a shit if he's a leftist or not. The point is not whether or not leftists identify with this person who killed the healthcare executive. The point is that non-leftists do, right? The point is that everyday people, see this. It's an absolute, it's an absolutely clear symptom of a hegemonic crisis, right? And so to have these trials going on at the same time will be completely interesting, right? And wild.
Yeah.
I think this goes into the constitutive misattunement, though, because I'm thinking about, you're asking, Geo, like, why did they do this? And I think the constitutive misattunement, to me, it like brings in Senwar, right? That the settler state thought releasing that video of Senwar's assassination would make it look like he's weak. And instead, what it showed everybody was how this person of the land, this warrior, this resistance fighter, was fighting till the last breath, right? On the front lines, and sort of threw into everything, every lie they had told before. So I think the spectacle is the spectacle of fascism, parading him through the streets of New York with an open van, all these sorts of things. But I think the constitutive misattunement is that you can't see this as an opportunity, actually. The other side of it that I'm thinking about psychoanalytically or psychically is these are also ways that you normalize certain precedents, which is why we're about divestment and disruption of normalization. If we're talking about issues of sovereignty, right? When you do say President Maduro and you do this anyway, there's a way in which psychically, and this is why we have to be really aware of this, there's a way in which you're saying we can fuck with the leader of a sovereign nation. And this becomes a normalized, okay thing to do, in the sense of this is a new stage of overt empire. It's not a covert operation, which has happened all the time. This is just like, this is what we do. And so I'm on both sides. On the one hand, constitutively misattuned. On the other hand, I'm thinking, but this is a fascistic process that sort of invites us in to normalizing a new type of process and what new world or whatever we want to call it.
Yeah, and I think that's right, Lara, and I think it's also like a really weak attempt. I mean, I think one of the things that, if you read like Ray Grandin, right? Like he talks about how there's two reasons why Latin America has been an imperial laboratory or workshop for U.S. empire. It's not just about what they've learned, like tactics and approaches that they've learned in the exterior, like how to achieve domination in the region. It's also about how you kind of bring together unwieldy political coalitions within the U.S. to then produce some sort of hegemonic outcome, whether it's like FDR in the 1930s from a more like liberal left position, or Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan brought together the quote unquote new right because he was able to use Central America, the killing fields of Central America, to bring down these disparate right-wing movements into a coalition that then did achieve some level of political and ideological hegemony, right? Like you still had Barack Obama paying homage to Ronald Reagan. In this particular moment, as we've been talking about, and it's not about being optimistic, as Gio was saying earlier. It's just there's a political and ideological weakness in this effort by Trump and his people. And I don't see, for a variety of reasons. Again, it's always important to keep in mind that a lot of what they're doing to Latin America and what they're saying about Latin America and the Caribbean is for domestic consumption. In one way, it's to justify the increasing internal authoritarianism that we see through ICE raids and through Border Patrol raids. But he's so personal. I mean, he has a certain level of charisma that's what has allowed the GOP to kind of use him as a certain vehicle, or the right. But the right is also a fractious, internally divided movement. And whether Trump can achieve something akin to Reagan by attacking Venezuela and potentially attacking other countries in the region, they can create mass suffering and devastation, no doubt, which is what the U.S. empire tends to do. But in terms of like a lasting political project, I don't know. I see it as a pretty weak attempt, thankfully, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, like, it's not just the riskiness. Like, it is the projection of power is a risky maneuver, right? It's risky because it's a turn to sort of hard power instead of soft power, but also because it corresponds to Trump dismantling soft power in the region, dismantling U.S. institutions of soft power. When Trump dismantled USAID, I know many people were sad about it. I know that there was concrete material suffering that came as a result of it, but USAID was the key mechanism that the U.S. had used to fund the Venezuelan opposition, right? USAID as a counterinsurgent institution was, right? And Trump is giving up on soft power, right? He's giving up on the sort of ways that particularly the Democratic Party, but elements of the Republican Party would deploy U.S. power, right? Which is through less obvious, less apparent means, right? And the thing is, you have to kind of do one or the other. He didn't have to dismantle everything, but the projection is premised on the fact that it weakens soft power already, right? It weakens the credibility of soft power. It weakens the role of the U.S. And so U.S. leaders have spent decades trying to build up an institutional apparatus that in a very covert and sneaky way will sort of infuse U.S. power across the globe. And Trump is withdrawing that. He's dismantling it. And I think obviously it will be reconstituted on some level, but it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of resources to do so, and a lot of time. And so I think he is weakening, in the long term, or the medium term at least, weakening the U.S. imperial capacity.
And I think this is where his, I often am very wary of diagnosing, right, power in this way. But let's say, like, the impact, there's a sociopathic, which comes with fascism, right? A sociopathic way of, like, soft power is actually not needed in his mind anymore. All you do is hard power. You just bully everything. You cause mass destruction. You squeeze people, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this is the part for us, for those of us that aren't on the ground, that might not be under the brunt or the boot of the material impact of that. Like, what are the ways that we remain focused and offer solidarity and stand in solidarity in all the ways? It's not just like performative, right? Precisely because this is actually happening, and this is happening on a global scale. This is not just, in the ways that we're seeing it in the most intense ways. This move from soft power to hard power in this way is important for us to track and see. Okay, this is precisely the stuff of fascism. Now, what you're saying, Geo, also is that takes fucking resources and money.
Yeah.
And Venezuela's oil is supposed to pay for that,
mm-hmm.
right? Which is his little line.
Yeah, no. I mean, standing in solidarity is incredibly important. And again, it's a little daunting because solidarity is, unfortunately, and again, I can be critical all we want of people, but solidarity is materially easier when there are resources for that solidarity. When things are easier, solidarity, unfortunately, we have this situation where the Venezuelan revolution has been in dire straits for a decade, right? And so the moment in which the Venezuelan revolution needs more solidarity, it's much harder to do so, right? And people are less likely to do so because they themselves are psychically invested in the idea that revolution is this beautiful utopian thing, right? Revolution is not that, dude. Revolution is fucking ugly, right? And difficult, and a long, long process. And it involves defeating and destroying your enemies, right? And here I'm going to try not to go on a sort of rant against the sort of ultra left critics. But the thing is, like, but the reality is, and again, I'm on the ultra left, like, I'll be clear about that. But if you don't understand that we have enemies to defeat, right? Then you're not understanding anything about what revolution looks like. If you don't understand that it takes time and struggle, and then not everything looks perfect, right? If you're willing to throw the Bolivarian revolution under the bus because you disagree with this or that policy, or the current government that's sort of like running, the revolutionary process, then you don't understand what revolution looks like, right? Or you don't understand what is necessary to make it actually happen, right? And so you've got this sort of like psychic structure on the side of people who make their solidarity contingent on perfection, right, and purity, which is never going to get us, very far. But I started with trying to really identify the difficulty of that solidarity, right? It became very hard for flights, down to Venezuela to see what's actually going on. It became hard for the Venezuelan government to have the direct connections with the Bronx, with indigenous communities in the U.S. through Citgo. All of these things, the goal of that was to sort of make that solidarity much more difficult. If we're talking about, I know you said you didn't want to diagnose, but and this is maybe the most armchair understanding of Donald Trump, but it seems to be sort of consistent, which is the fact that this is someone who was taught as a young child and in an abusive, relationship, presumably with his father, that if he just talked and talked and talked about something, it would become true. If he insisted and said something that was, not true, it would become true. And that's such a deep fucking psychosis that's going on there, but it's also not like untrue, right? Like it's not like it's been very effective for him. Everything is a deal, everything is leverage, everything.
Also white man entitlement.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You're socialized to,
and using that, but also using it and deploying it in a brutal way to make reality something different, to make it into the thing that you want it to be, right? And then again, that is the source of his power, and it's also like the sort of feet of clay that he's standing on, right? Which is that it really, really depends on a whole range of pieces that if they collapse, the whole thing collapses. And I think what solidarity means is bringing down the Trump regime, right? And what solidarity means is in the very short term, insisting, and I don't like the Democratic Party, but in this moment, the Democrats need to block any kind of funding to war with Venezuela. That's the minimal fucking bare minimum they can do, right? And again, this happened in the 80s. It's not impossible. They can say, listen, we did not authorize this. We do not authorize more of it. We will make it difficult for you to fund war with Venezuela, right? That is the bare fucking minimum. And the demand, of course, is for the release of Nicolás and Celia, their return, the recognition of Venezuelan sovereignty, and the lifting of the sanctions. Nothing is more important right now than the lifting of the sanctions, right? That is the most important thing, right? Because it's the sanctions that have created a situation in which the US government is pointing to Venezuela and saying, look, the oil industry is failing. Look, people are starving. Look, the government is being repressive. Look at this. All of that is anchored in this incredibly brutal series of sanctions that people don't really understand how it works, right? And it had different pieces that emerged in different stages, but it made it impossible for Venezuela to produce oil, right? Impossible for it to maintain the oil industry, to buy the parts, to buy the chemical additives and inputs that are required to sort of extract the oil and produce it and export it, right? It made it impossible for them to ship the oil abroad, right? They're paying wartime shipping insurance on boats that are then shipped halfway across the globe and sold at a discount, right? So the oil that's being sold to Russia and China is barely making any money for Venezuela, even though they need to sell it. The issue is not that, there's not enough oil being pumped. The issue is that they can't even get rid of the oil that they have sometimes, right? Because of how brutal these sanctions are. And this is a country in which all of the food almost comes from abroad. All of the food requires that oil money to buy it. And so when you have sanctions, you are committing murder.
I mean, you're inviting us into a reality testing exercise, Geo, which is at the heart of all of this. Because if we're talking, part of the reason why I don't diagnose is because it implies curability. And I don't think fascistic ideology is curable. It needs to be disrupted, dismantled, right? Fought against. But this is a reality testing exercise because empire, settler colonialism invites us, seduces us, relies on us actually to bend reality. And it can be in very small ways, like using language. Alex, I've heard you talk about that. Like you need to say this is a kidnapping. You need to say this is an abduction. You need to talk about that. These aren't pedantic points. This is actually us refusing to join in the reality bending that empire relies on, or at the very least disrupt Trump's ability to just keep saying something and then it becomes a truth because these other motherfuckers are not challenging him, right? They're all completely submitting fully and joining it, even if they don't believe it or think it's bonkers, they're still acting as though and going along. So part of it is us at every turn. This is the antagonism, I think, at least to not let it also settle within us without antagonism about that this is what reality is. What you're saying is what reality is, even in terms of the oil, like drawing, here's the fucking reason why. And us engaging in like mapping out the reasons why something is what it is at this moment is an exercise of that. Alex, I think you wanted to say something. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I think it's, these are incredibly important points. And it's like, just like the bare minimum for those of us who are in the US, right? Like it's, when we talk about economic sanctions, I mean, we have studies that show that these quote unquote economic sanctions are a different form of waging war that have resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of people, right? Whether it's CEPR or the Lancet, like doing studies, like they've shown the evidence that this is just a different way of waging war that Venezuela has experienced in really intensified form since 2017, since Trump 1.0. But that really begins before, and the precedent is Obama declaring Venezuela to be a national security threat to the United States in like 2015, right? So, yeah, I think that the question of language is really important because it exposes, like, I think we need to be pushing to expose like what really is at stake here. This is not about narco-terrorism. This is not about Nicolás Maduro being the head of a drug cartel called El Cartel de los Soles, who apparently was moving illegal machine gun. Like, it's none of that, right? Like, I think the language is important to help people, at least in the US, understand what really is at stake. Venezuela is not the end. This is the beginning, right? And they've already have signaled as such. Yesterday, I saw an interview with a short little press interview with Chuck Schumer, who said, I asked Rubio or asked Trump's people if there were, attempts to or plans to attack Colombia and Cuba. And he's like, and his response was, I was not satisfied at all by their answer. It's like, okay, like do something. Okay, so that's not good. I don't know how else to put it, right? Like that is like all the red alarm emojis, right? Like the fact that this is not the end of something, but potentially the beginning. And now, and then Mexico's on that list as well, particularly now since Mexico is being the main provider of oil to Cuba in the context of this campaign that's been waged against Venezuela, for years, but especially since they started sending in the U.S. Navy into the Caribbean to blockade this country. I think we just need to be really direct and honest what this is really about. And again, going back to the question that I posed earlier, is that why does U.S. empire find Latin American assertions of national sovereignty and self-determination to be an intolerable thing or even an obstacle? Every single revolutionary movement in Latin America, at least in the 20th century, they all had the same core. Like they had ideological differences, ideological frameworks, but at the core of these movements, national sovereignty and social justice. So the question is like, why were those things a necessity? Why did those demands spur mass-based popular social revolutions against elites? And this is that history didn't stop. Like we're living through it right now. Those two core values remain revolutionary demands that remain an obstacle to U.S. imperial designs for the region.
And I've said this before, but I want to say it again. This is where I'm implicating my field. Every single one of those counterinsurgent actions included psychoanalysts and psychologists, which just brings back, the centrality of the psychological warfare that's involved in this, both in terms of their actions with sovereign nations, but also here in the settler colony of the United States. I could speak to both of you forever, but I want to give you your life back, and people, I'm sure, have a lot of things to do. But any final sort of thoughts that you all have, analysis, things you want people to be thinking about, looking out for, and then also where they can find you and your work and your thinking. I mean, I'm going to say this again. These two are some of the main people that I follow and I listen to and I learn from intellectually and have been nourished by. And when I'm struggling to be like, okay, I need to see what the fucking roots of this are, these are two of the folks that I turn to. So I hope others will also follow them. But last thoughts or summaries or a little bit more Fanon, Geo?
Well, I was going to say, so, I mean, first things first, I, work at the Du Bois Movement School, Abolition School, follow Abolition School, support Abolition School. We are honestly going through it when it comes to the sort of like cowardice of the nonprofit industrial complex right now. And so we do need resources. We have an ongoing fundraiser that needs your support. Plug in if you're on the ground in Philly. Also plug into our hybrid program if you're not. We've run 2 semesters already of a hybrid program, first on Black Reconstruction by Du Bois, then on the Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. And you can watch and catch up with all of those. But we run this hybrid, in a way that you can come on much like this format and leave questions, live as it's happening. And in the spring, we will be running a full 12 weeks on Fanon. So please plug into that. Please donate to support. Please follow Abolition School, and support the work that we're doing over there. Because what we're trying to do is really to generate and develop a new generation of organic revolutionary intellectuals, right? And we're trying to encourage people that, despite the sort of daunting and absolutely perilous nature of our times, that this is a time to be brave, right? That we can be brave, that when we're brave and when we're brave together, we have a much better chance than when we're not. And that every resort to force and resort to sort of panicked use of violence that the state is engaging in now is a symptom of a hegemonic crisis, right? That crisis is an opportunity for us. The center has collapsed. The arguments and the ideologies and the hegemonic framings that are used to uphold the system of US colonial settler capitalism are absolutely collapsing. That is why the right is surging, and it's our job to sort of meet that surge on the left and to defeat it. So.
Thanks so much, Geo. I can't say enough about the project, and thank you so much for doing that. Follow them on Instagram, and I've asked Sina actually to drop your website into the main chat so folks have access to it. Support in any way you can, and I know so many comrades who've been through your, have learned with you, on the ground with you. I get texts all the time being like, Geo's awesome, so check them out, folks, for sure. Alex?
I don't know. I'm going to start teaching next week. So I'm going to go away and you guys won't see me. No, I'm kidding. Let's see. I am on Twitter. You can find me there. I write very infrequently for a Substack called Foreign Exchanges. That's run by Derek Davison, who's part of the American Prestige podcast. I think the stakes are really high right now. And I like what Geo said about not being afraid. We can't be afraid precisely because those stakes are so high, but domestically and internationally. And I would just reiterate the point that both of these are fundamentally dialectically connected. I'm not a theorist like you guys, but I'll try my highfalutin theorist skills and say to keep that. I think we need to keep both things in mind and to talk about how they're fundamentally connected. So yes, keep following what's happening to Venezuela. Unfortunately, I don't think it's the final word on it in terms of the region, but thinking about how that's fundamentally connected to what we've been witnessing domestically, particularly in terms of like ICE raids and border patrol raids. And Venezuela, obviously, as we didn't talk about it as much, but Venezuela is really important in that regard as well, as a central component of the Trump's, what I would say is an ethnic cleansing campaign against migrants and refugees. So that's what I would conclude with.
Thank you both so much. And you kicked off Psychic Militancy live episodes. I can't think of two better people to do that, two more generous people to do that. I really appreciate it. And thank you everybody in the chat. The chat was awesome. If you don't get the chance to do that, and subscribe, and we'll see you soon.
Mm-hmm.